Weak jobs growth, a ballooning deficit, and bitterly divided Congress. As the year comes to a close, crucial issues face the U.S. economy. For solutions, we turn to three key figures from traditionally different parts of the political spectrum. Mort Zuckerman is a billionaire press and property tycoon based in New York. Jeffrey Sachs is a professor at Columbia and special advisor to the UN Secretary General. And David Stockman is the architect of the landmark Reagan-era tax cuts, who now calls for tax hikes across the board to combat the deficit. David, let's start with you. We've had deficit problems before in the U.S. What's different this time?
Basically, 30 years of breakdown in fiscal governance. Since the early 80s, we've had a referendum, really, about what we want in government and how we're going to pay for it. And the Republican Party has basically decided there's not much they really want to cut. And the Democrats have repaired to defend everything that was there. So we have basically two parties, two free lunch parties, competing in a fiscal arena that is non-functional. And it's led to a structural deficit that is now ballooned to really very dangerous proportions.
Right. So, you have to operate in the real world. I mean, forget about politics. You have to run businesses. You have to face budgets all the time. If I'm your CEO and I hand you this happens to be from the Peterson Foundation, and I say, this is what our company looks like. This is our projection. What do you do as a CEO?
Well, the one thing that I think you can do in a business is to cut costs. You're not always sure that you can increase revenues. Mm-hmm. So you start focusing on cutting costs, and you see what you can do to increase revenues. But you cannot live. This is not a sustainable kind of loss to be looking at. It's not sustainable, in my judgment, for the federal government. And I'll say this. The politics of it, if we just looked at the recent congressional election, there were a lot of people who were concerned about the debt and the deficits. And in my judgment, the reason for that is we now have, 12 million homes where the mortgage exceeds the value of the homes, and huge numbers of people who have credit card lines that they can't pay off. All of a sudden they realize debt has consequences. And I think the country understands that debt has consequences for the country, and that these debts essentially are a dagger pointed at the heart of the economy. And sooner or later that dagger is going to strike.
So are we facing a situation where we're going to have to see a crisis, or we're going to have to see real dislocation, interest rates higher, some sort of fallout before people can actually make a substantive decision to tackle this? Do you think it has to get to that point?
Well, often this kind of situation goes on until there is a crisis, but of course that's not the desirable way out of this. We would expect political leadership. We would expect the president to be taking a much more clear policy. The disappointing part about the administration is that they actually believe in deficits as a good thing right now. They think that they boost the economy, so it's worth running bigger deficits. They didn't view this last agreement with the Republicans as a tough thing that they had to swallow for political reasons. They viewed this as a great success. So the answer is, yes, we could go on for a while and build massive debts up to China and to others. We could have quite a long slide. You never know when this kind of circumstance erupts into a sudden market panic, as it has in some of the European countries.
Right. And it appears that the American people have some clue of that as well, because there was a Bloomberg poll recently. 48%, almost half of Americans say the budget shortfall is dangerously out of control. But 82% say don't touch Medicare. 72% don't touch Medicaid. 75% they don't even want a gasoline tax. More, I think that when you talk to them, there's a quote, we give billions of dollars to corporations. In my eyes, they pretty much just put it in their pocket. They think businesses should pay for it and the rich should pay for it.
If the wealthy aren't seen to picking up their fair share of what we're going to have to do in order to eliminate these deficits, we'll never get anywhere. And frankly, the wealthy can afford it, and they've done very well, thank you very much, and they should do this. So I really do believe that that is absolutely essential to going forward and having any kind of sane fiscal policy.
What about the private? What about business? Okay, go ahead.
I think what Mort is saying is extremely important, and it's important to take a long view of what's happened. In our society for the last 25 years, basically there's only one part of the society that's done well, and that's been at the very top of the income distribution. And the more close to the top you get, the more extraordinary, so that there have been huge, huge gains at the very top of the income distribution. At the bottom's fallen out, and the middle class has basically struggled. If the rich were standing up and saying, we do our part, the mood in this society would change enormously. Right. We'd start getting serious again, like grown-ups, and thinking about the real situation in the United States. What do we need to compete internationally? How do we close the budget deficit?
If you're not going to get a bunch of wealthy people to stand up and say, let's pay more taxes, you've got to get the government and a leader in the government who has credibility in the country who's going to make this case and fight for it.
But people would say that the politicians are owned by corporate lobbyists who pay all that money to keep the status quo there. I know there's no, if we take for granted there's no leadership in Washington, what's the leadership from the private sector? Should there be higher corporate tax rates? The minute you hear that, they say, we'll take our business offshore, it'll kill the U.S. economy.
I'm not sure it's a big part of the solution one way or another, okay, because it's just a political food fight. It's a full employment act for the lobbyists. Once you get into the corporate tax, generates a couple $100 billion a year. It's really not the issue. I think the issue is we overconsume as a society, and we have done that for 30 years by borrowing money in the household and the government sector beyond what's sustainable. So if we're going to raise revenue, I think we need to raise it on things we need to discourage. We got two things to discourage. One is overconsumption, and that means some kind of consumption tax.
Sales tax, VAT.
Something like that. And second, the casino that Wall Street has turned into. These aren't capital markets. It's nothing but a casino in which robots trade with each other in a millisecond. So I say tax that.
Alan Blinder has said that there are 28 to 42 million jobs that will be susceptible to being shipped offshore. Princeton professor, vice chair, Board of Government. Corporations are sitting on $2 trillion in cash. Why aren't they investing it in human capital? I mean, why aren't they doing more in terms of retraining, respending, especially as government tries to cut down on spending? Can the private sector pick up the ball there?
No, to a very limited degree. That's not their job. Their job, the reason why they aren't spending is because
they
don't think the economy is good.
I think another point on the business sector. Business would invest if it thought it could make money right now. So the fact that it's sitting on the cash means that it's not really a liquidity or a lending problem we have. We have a profitability problem. And where investment's taking place is overseas. Where jobs are being created is overseas. Why? Because to create jobs here that are internationally competitive, you need better skills. And that's where we want to invest in our youth, make sure that we don't come out 31st in math worldwide. That's the ticket to ruin.
And when you're in the budget pickle we're in, can you do both those things at the same time? Can you spend wisely while still aggressively cutting the budget deficit?
I think we have to just realize that most of the federal budget is transfer payments. Okay, it's there. The education dollars in this $4 trillion of spending is a rounding error. The real issue is we've got to get a chairman of the Federal Reserve who will simply say one thing: I've printed my last dollar. Because once they stop printing money and interest rates start to rise, then we will get fiscal action and we will get focus. But as long as they think they can just keep selling the debt and that the Fed will buy it as the buyer of last resort, which is what QE2 is all about, nothing's going to change.
Is the person or the group that shows that leadership, do they have to expect to be a one-term president, a one-term Congress, because the news they're going to deliver is so painful? Because I'll tell you right now, there's not a senior citizen in the world who's going to vote for you to cut their benefits or start means testing Social Security, and they're a huge voting bloc.
I think that one thing that I've seen in working with governments all over the world is that when a government is honest and clear, the public is so amazed. It stands up and it can reelect them even in the face of very tough measures. These politicians actually don't have their finger on the pulse of America, in my opinion. Americans wanted change. They didn't get it. But it was a very clear lead that they were given, and that they haven't gotten it.
They did get change, but change for the worse, not for the better.
Well, I don't know if they really got changed. It's so much continuity here. Basically, we've continued the same wars. We've continued the same tax cuts.
We got the Bush war and the Bush tax cuts.
Yeah.
What change did we get?
So in this sense, I don't think it's right to say that what the public will or won't accept. What is true is if you put something that's real, coherent, sensible, explained, like grown-ups,
right.
You can get very far. I've seen it. I've been involved in reform efforts around the world, and I'm shocked at our country and our inability to have a decent discourse
about
as
it.
So many parts of the world have had.
And Mort, I'm going to give you the last word on this.
The way to make this program work is to make sure that there is a shared sacrifice. You can't just have it put on the backs of one particular group. You have to have a shared sacrifice, and amongst the people who have to share it are those who can afford it the best.